Everyone, in this video we're going to talk about the different mode of transmission, cellular transmission in across the cell membrane. So a different cell can across the cell membrane, the transport of material can happen through diffusion or facilitated diffusion, osmosis, or active transport, or bulk transfer. So these are the different types of transport mechanisms. So if you're considering diffusion of liquids, so what is the process of diffusion? Diffusion is actually a process in which a liquid dissolved into another liquid, or it doesn't require energy and it just diffuses from one part of the solution to another. For instance, if you put a dye in water, the dye will diffuse into the water solution. So this is called diffusion. If the other example would be if you're making tea and you put milk in water, and the milk separates evenly in water, that's just the milk diffusing into the water. So diffusion is net movement of molecules or ions from a region of high concentration to a region of low concentration. So when you put the milk in one spot in boiling water, that's the region of high concentration, and then it spreads to the other part of the water, which is the region of low concentration. The molecule moves down a concentration gradient, and molecules have a kinetic energy which makes them move about randomly, and as a result of diffusion, molecules reach an equilibrium where they are evenly spread out. So that's when the diffusion stops. This is when there is no net movement of molecules from either side. Alright, so diffusion is a passive process, so it does not require any energy, and is used to make the molecule move. They have a natural kinetic energy, so diffusion does not require energy. So if diffusion happens across cell membrane, it's without the use of any energy, and it happens by itself. This is just an example, diffusion of bromine. So if you put bromine in the bottom of the tube and you put water in, bromide will separate in tube. See, that's 0.0. So this region is region of high concentration, and you see passage of time it will flow. So this is diffusion bromine. So across the cell membrane, this is, if you consider this as the inside part of a cell, and this is the outside of a cell, and this is the cell membrane that separates the inside of the cell from the outside cell. And if we assume these small red molecules, so these small red molecules can actually diffuse through the pores in the cell membrane, or through the gates or the channel protein that we described in previous videos, and move to the outside of the cell. This process is called diffusion. It does not require energy. You can see the diffusion stops when the equilibrium is reached. So when the number of molecules on this side equals the number of molecules on that side. So diffusion molecules move constantly and randomly. Over time, they will distribute themselves evenly, and small hydrophobic molecules can diffuse in and out of the cell. So this process can only happen for small and hydrophobic molecules. Hydrophilic molecules or large molecules need to have other form of transport across the cell membrane. Alright. So you can see in this slide the molecules are here. If this is the inside of the cell and this out of the cell, see, in the outside of the cell, in this case the molecules are here and nothing here, but after a while you can see the molecules are evenly distributed both inside and outside the cell. So this process is called diffusion. So what determines the rate of diffusion? So how fast the process of diffusion will go is determined by the rate of diffusion, and there are four factors involved. Number one is the steepness of the concentration gradient. The bigger the difference between the two sides of the membrane, the quicker the rate of diffusion, self-explanatory. And then the temperature. The higher the temperature gives the molecule more kinetic energy, and that means the molecule move around faster, so diffusion is faster. Diffusion also depends on the surface area. So if the larger the surface area, for example, the bigger the cell membrane, the greater the faster diffusion rate would be. This is because the more molecules or ions can cross the membrane at any one moment. Alright, so the type of molecules or ions diffusing. So smaller molecules will have small molecules can pass quickly, while large molecules tend to struggle. Alright, so the molecule, what the different types of molecules that diffuse through the cell membrane are gases, which are oxygen, so non-polar, so diffuse very quickly across the lipid bilayer, and then carbon dioxide, it again diffuse very quickly, and water polar but also very small, so diffuse quickly. We said non-polar initially, but water is polar. However, because the molecule is small, so the water can pass easily across the cell membrane. Alright, so what is facilitated diffusion? So facilitated diffusion is actually a process in which large polar molecules such as glucose and amino acid can move across cell membrane. So large polar molecules such as glucose and amino acid cannot diffuse across the phospholipid bilayer. Also ions such as sodium and chloride cannot pass. So what the cell membrane does in this case is that it transports them through a process called facilitated diffusion. These molecules pass through protein channel instead. Diffusion through these channels is called facilitated diffusion. Movement of molecule is still passive, just like ordinary diffusion. The only difference is the molecule go through the protein channel instead of passing through the phospholipid. So simple explanation, if you consider the cell membrane as a wall, some molecules like gases can pass through the bricks of the wall, but other molecules, if you want to transport cargo across the wall, you need a gate, and some channel proteins or some proteins in the cell membrane provides a gate for transport of these large cargo molecules, and this process is called facilitated diffusion. This is just example. So this is a channel protein, and if see, you can look at this diagram and see if the molecules are small, they can squeeze through here to the lipid bilayer, but if they are large, then they need a bigger space, and this channel protein provides a bigger space for the molecule, the cargo, to pass through. So glucose and amino acid cannot go through here, but water and gases can. So the glucose will make its way through this gate and enter the cell. Again, this is another illustration. So see these small molecules, imagine these are oxygen or water, can pass easily through the small pores, but these large molecules, assuming these are carbohydrate, needs the bigger channel to pass through. See, this is a protein channel, this molecule will pass through, and eventually there would be even distribution. However, it's important to know that even transport to this gate does not require any energy, which is why it's still called diffusion. So molecules will randomly move through the opening like pores by diffusion. This requires no energy. It's passive process. Molecules move from area of high concentration to area of low concentration, and this is what we explained earlier. So facilitated diffusion is for molecule that is too large or charged to diffuse on its own, can diffuse if there is a specific transport protein channel. So these are the two conditions. So facilitated diffusion is for large molecules that cannot diffuse by itself, and it requires the use of a channel. You can see is the molecules is the channel, has to pass through the channel. Osmosis. So the second process through which transport of cargo across the cell membrane happens, always stress on it, assume the cell membrane as a wall, is called osmosis. So the diffusion of water molecule from an area of high concentration of water molecule, higher water potential, to an area of low concentration of water molecule, low water potential, across a partially permeable membrane. So osmosis is a process solely for water molecules. So if the concentration of water molecule is high on one side of the cell membrane, it will pass through the cell membrane to make the equilibrium. And now this osmosis is different from diffusion only because there is a partial permeable membrane involved, if that makes sense. So diffusion does not require presence of membrane. So if you put a drop of milk in water to spread, that's diffusion, but that's not called osmosis. Osmosis is when is if there's a membrane separating the water and the milk molecule, and then there is a movement of water across the two solution. So that's the only difference. All right, so This is the area of high water concentration. You can see there, if you assume the red as water molecules, you see number of water molecules, there are only 2. So osmosis is process, and there's like this membrane. So cell membrane is partially permeable, we explained this earlier. So when the water passes from this side of the cell, which is the inside of the cell, to the outside of the cell, this process is called osmosis, because there is a membrane involved. So movement of water molecule across the cell membrane is not diffusion, although it doesn't require energy, but because there's a membrane involved, which is the cell membrane, it's called osmosis. That's the only difference between osmosis and diffusion. See, osmosis happens, water molecule distribute evenly. And this is the end of osmosis. Equilibrium, water molecule, equal water concentration on either side. Each water molecule has been reached. This is there is no net movement of water. That's the end point. How molecules cross the membrane? All right, so again, osmosis, to the fact checking ourselves. So osmosis involves water molecule to pass through cell membrane. So water and moving outside. In this case, moving inside and outside. Water tries to dilute out molecules that cannot move across the membrane until the concentration is equal. Hope that makes sense. You can see in this case, when the water moves, in the first example, when water moves inside the cell, see the cell size increase. Or in the second case, when the water molecules move outside the cell, because most of the environment in the cell is watery, cell size decrease and shrink. So water is a basic component of cell membrane. So movement of water is critical to be controlled by the cell membrane. See, as I said earlier, cell must maintain a very high or low level of some molecules. Passive transport cannot do this. So this brings us to the third form of transport, active transport. Active transport, cell must maintain a very high or low level of some molecules, like ions, for instance. Active transport proteins are usually use energy to pump molecule in or out of the cell. So you can assume a wall and then assume an electronic gate, and assume there is assume a dam, a water dam. So the wall in front of a dam, there's a lot of water on one side of the dam, which is a reservoir, but there's less water on the other side. However, that dam, the door of the dam is energetically, or using electrical energy, closed or shut, closed or opened, to allow some water molecule to pass through the dam. Same way, there are protein channels that are present on the cell membrane that will allow certain molecules to pass from inside to the outside of the cell, and from the outside to the inside of the cell, depending on the need of the cell for those molecules. So if you assume the dam, then we need water to produce energy, so we have to have a lot of water stored, and so we only will release certain amount of water from the dam to prevent overflow. So the same goes for the cell membrane. So a cell membrane will only allow molecules that the cell do not need to go outside the cell, and will also actively transport molecules that it needs from the outside to the inside of the cell. So for active transport, a cell must maintain a very high or low level of some molecules, as is what we said earlier, and this process requires energy. You can see in this case the concentration on the outside is low, but still these proteins are specialized to push the molecule inside, as you can see. And again, in this case, there's a lot of molecules here, but still it will force more molecule inside. All right, so this is just a table which illustrates shows the differences between each type. So diffusion in terms of energy, diffusion, osmosis and facilitated diffusion does not require any energy, but active transport does. And type of molecule, so diffusion is for small and water hydrophobic molecules, osmosis is just for water, facilitated diffusion is for larger molecules, and active transport can be small or large. So facilitated diffusion is usually for large molecules, sorry, but it can involve small molecules as well. So direction of diffusion is always from the high to low concentration. Again, high to low for osmosis, high to low for facilitated diffusion, but for ectotransport it can be against the concentration gradient depending on the need of the cell. Yeah, so diffusion, osmosis, facilitated diffusion does not require energy, but ectotransport does. And the proteins involved, like the specialized channels in the membrane, diffusion doesn't require it, osmosis doesn't require it, but facilitated diffusion and ectotransport requires the use of special components in a cell membrane. Yeah, okay, so this just shows facilitated diffusion. So this is a protein channel, glucose will just go through it inside the cell. Again, so this is actually illustration of how food is digested from the gut so to the blood. So if this is the gut, the glucose, the food we eat, will just go through here. The channel protein here will get the glucose inside the cell through facilitated diffusion, and then from this cell to the bloodstream, the channel protein will again pass the glucose through facilitated diffusion into the blood. This is just an example of facilitated diffusion. Alright, so this example shows how the gut cell actually maintains its molecular concentration to allow the inflow of glucose inside the cell. So when glucose enters into the cell, it also requires the movement of other molecules, and in this case, for example, if this cell loses a lot of water, then this channel will close and it will not allow glucose inside. So for glucose to come inside, and the aqueous environment needs to be maintained, then there also needs to be a water inflow into the cell to maintain the integrity of the cell, otherwise this cell will die. Anyways, if you want, for the sake of this presentation, you can ignore this, but what this diagram shows is that one process of transport does not happen on its own or individually. Sometime, if facilitated diffusion is happening, then osmosis needs to happen to keep the cell in proper functioning capacity, if that makes sense. Like if one thing needs to be taken in by the cell, then also needs to be export of another thing, and that might have to happen through a different process, which can be osmosis or diffusion or ectotransport. Alright, so what happens when a cell is put in water and different water concentrations? See, if you put a cell placed in dilute distal water, so if the cell is placed in water, like high concentration of water, then cell will keep on. So these are red blood cells, and they are like this in shape. But if you put them in water, dilute water, a cell will keep on absorbing water through osmosis and it will burst. You can see here. If you put them in like low water concentration or a salt solution which has less water but more salt, then the water from the inside of the cell will move based on the concentration gradient towards the outside of the cell, and you can see the cell is shrinking because the water is moving outside, and hence the cell will shrink. In both cases, the cell death is achieved. So by this slide we are trying to show that a cell needs to be in proper environment to survive. Again, this is just an illustration. Cell bursting and cell shrinking. Alright, so what is exocytosis? So the opposite of endocytosis, exocytosis. Alright, so this is another form of transport across the cell membrane. Alright, so it's very hard to explain it like just by me saying it, but assume it's just like if you open your mouth and put food inside and you just engulf it. If you imagine a cell membrane as like having a mouth, and it just and something comes close to it and then engulfs it like that and takes it inside, that process is called endocytosis. So it takes that substance inside the cell by engulfing it, using itself as a by making a mouth-like structure and actually engulfing that substrate inside the cell. And exocytosis is the opposite. So if a molecule is present in the inside of the cell, and again the cell membrane makes a mouth-like structure to engulf it and throw it out of the cell, outside of the cell, across the cell membrane. So these are the two different processes. That's how they can be explained, but it requires further explanation. I'll probably do that in other videos, but it's just one type of cell membrane transport process. This is just a diagram showing different carrier proteins. You can see these are different proteins that can be used in active transport or in facilitated diffusion. Again, this is just different cells showing what happens. So if the cell is put in, so if plant cells, so this is okay, this is plant cells. So plant cells have got a cell wall, it's a rigid structure. So if plant cells are put in water, they don't burst because the cell wall, the cell will go big, but not big. It won't increase from a certain size because the cell wall is strict, is rigid. But if you lose a lot of water, then you can see the cell will die because the organization of the cell component will change. This is the difference between plant and animal cell when put in solution of different water concentrations. This process again is osmosis. What's happening here is osmosis of water. So this diagram actually explains the process of endocytosis. So you can see there's this food particle comes here near the cell membrane. Cell membrane makes a mouth-like structure, engulfs it, and moves it here inside the cell. And so this will still be enclosed in a membrane because this membrane was formed here in the cell membrane. See, and if it wants to excrete it, the molecule, see, it will take all the necessary substances out of this sac, the cell on the inside. So this is happening on the inside of the cell, and all the waste, it will just go back here to the membrane, and the mouth will attach to the cell membrane. It will just move it outside. That is what I meant by endocytosis and exocytosis. But anyway, I will explain this in future videos. This is just another diagram of that. So all right, so now we are going into different so Cotransport is actually a combination of two different types of diffusion. So this means that if one molecule is going inside the cell, then another molecule is going outside. So sometimes this is required for different purposes across cell membrane. So if you're considering it as a trade, then you sell somebody something and then you have to buy something. That's what cotransport is. So cotransport also uses the process of diffusion. In this case, a molecule that is moving naturally into the cell through diffusion is used to drag another molecule into the cell. In this example, glucose hitches a ride with sodium. So sodium and glucose have to be exchanged in order for the successful exchange to happen across the cell membrane. So when there is the exchange of molecules involved, it's called cotransport. And so there are receptor proteins involved in this. So these proteins are used in intracellular communication, and we're not going to show animation here, but so these are the proteins that are involved in cotransport. So cotransport also uses the process of diffusion. In this case, a molecule that is moving naturally into the cell, diffusion is used to drag another molecule into cell. So sometimes in cotransport, one process might be passive, like movement of glucose across the channel protein, but the second transport can be active transport, like movement of sodium. So there are actually two things happening. One is the active transport, and the other one is passive transport. Sorry, I just got a call. So there are carrier proteins that do not extend through the membrane. They bond and drag molecule through the lipid. Okay, so let's ignore this one. So vesicle-mediated transport, this is again similar to endocytosis and exocytosis. So sometime on the outside of the cell, there will be an entity, on the inside of the cell, there will be an entity which will be enclosed in a cell membrane like structure. So an entity will have a similar membrane as a cell membrane. So this membrane containing this substance will come close to the cell membrane and attach to it and excrete these substances out of the cell. This is critical when the cell, so this is vesicle-mediated transport is critical if the cell finds that there are some pathogens or poison inside the cell that is detrimental to the cell. Then the cell will form a layer around these poison or these unwanted material, and then will move this vessel. So the enclosed substance in the membrane is called a vesicle. Will move it to a cell membrane, and the cell membrane will actually help to remove these substances outside of the cell by incorporating this membrane in itself. So endocytosis, the cell membrane can also engulf structures that are much too larger to fit through the pores in the membrane to protein. This process is known as endocytosis. In this process, the membrane itself wraps around the particle and pinches off a vesicle inside the cell. In this animation, an amoeba engulfs a food particle. We're not going to show the animation, but this is just information. So a very large molecule can also be engulfed by the cell through endocytosis. Alright, so if this is the end of the presentation, but if you guys have any question, please feel free to ask and leave them in the comment section. I will try to answer them. I need to acknowledge the website from which I got most of the material, and it's free, so yeah, thank you to them. Saved me a lot of time making the presentation. Thank you, and enjoy learning.